Now we're going to compare some of the early theories of evolution. First, we're going to look at Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck, who is French, and looking at this theory in 1801. Lamarck had several different theories to help explain change over time and the relatedness of different organisms. The first being the theory of need. If you need it, you've got it. For example, monkeys with tails or giraffes with long necks. So we can see how logically that can help explain some things, but doesn't explain all structures that we see, and especially vestigial structures, such as hind limbs in snakes or in whales. There's the theory of use and disuse, the use it or lose it. For example, snakes with no legs or ostriches with small wings. Also had the theory of passing acquired traits to offspring. If you've got it, so will the kids. So for example, Lamarck believed that if you cut off all the tails of rats in one generation, when they breed and produce offspring, the offspring will also have no tails. This is the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Charles Darwin, an Englishman, in 1859 had the theory of natural selection. This is based on the following premises: that organisms produce more offspring than can survive, organisms face constant struggle to survive, that individuals of a species may vary, that being there's variation within the population itself, and individuals best suited for their environment survive. That's the concept of survival of the fittest. And that organisms that survive pass their successful traits on to their offspring. The classic example of comparing Lamarck's theory of inheritance of acquired characteristics and Darwin's theory of natural selection concerns the neck of giraffes. So Lamarck's explanation for how giraffes got their long neck over time, if we're looking at the fossil record, is represented here on the left, and Darwin's is represented on the right. For Lamarck, his thought was that early giraffes probably had short necks and they stretched to reach food. And so during their lifetime, individuals were able to stretch their necks, and that over time their offspring had longer necks and that they stretched to reach food. And so with each generation, giraffes had longer and longer necks. And so eventually the continued stretching of the neck resulted in today's giraffe. It's not a bad theory, but there's some issues with that, as it doesn't explain everything that we see. If we're looking at Darwin's theory of natural selection here on the right, his concepts have some slight differences here. His thought was that early giraffes probably had necks of various lengths. If we look at populations today, we do see variation within them. And so Darwin applied this concept to populations of the past. His thought was that natural selection, due to competition, led to survival of the longer-necked giraffes and their offspring. And so those that were able to reach food tended to live and produce more offspring, and then passed on those traits. So eventually, only the long-necked giraffes survived the competition. Notice the differences between the two theories. Darwin was certainly influenced by biologists from the preceding century, as well as by contemporaries. One of those was Lamarck. Like we were just looking at, Lamarck developed the theory of inheritance of acquired characteristics. To review that, this is that a characteristic that is acquired during an individual's lifetime can be passed on to offspring, and that the environment can bring about an inherited change. The example used by Lamarck was that the long neck of the giraffe developed over time because animals stretched their necks to reach food in trees. Then they pass gradually longer necks to their offspring. This hypothesis for the inheritance of acquired characteristics has never been verified. There are some similarities between this and epigenetic studies. but it's not consistent. Changes in an organism's visible traits or phenotype acquired during their lifetime do not result in genetic change that is heritable. So, for example, if a dog's tail is cropped, or if a human loses a finger, these traits are not passed on to the offspring. If you have Rottweilers or other dogs whose tails are usually docked, their puppies are still born with tails. So in contrast to Lamarck, Darwin proposed that traits which provided an advantage must be passed on to the next generation in order for adaptation to occur. Using the giraffe example, Darwin's theory would predict that giraffe populations would include individual giraffes with longer necks than others, and these individuals with longer necks could reach more leaves, acquire more energy, and potentially produce more offspring that inherited the long neck trait. Over time, the trait would be more common in a population, and this would be adaptation to the environment. A little bit of history in seeing how Darwin formed his theories. He sailed on the HMS Beagle as the ship's naturalist, so his job was to collect and record the geological and biological diversity observed during this 5-year voyage. He initially supported the idea that species had remained unchanged since the time of creation. This was the widely held belief of naturalists at the time. Darwin's beliefs were challenged during the 5-year voyage by his own observations. So starting in England, we can trace the path of the Beagle around the world. The Galapagos finches were one of the key organisms that helped Darwin form his beliefs. If we look back at our world map here are the Galapagos Islands. And they had very unique species that Darwin had never seen and that had adapted and changed differently than other organisms on the mainland. He noticed with the Galapagos finches that each different island had very different finches. This related to the environment and habitat of that particular island. He noticed especially that the beaks of the Galapagos finches were very different and well adapted to their particular food source on that island, whether they were longer and more narrow or if they were shorter and stronger. And the finches from each island were similar in overall appearance, but the main differences that Darwin noticed were in beak shape and size. He suggested that the different species of finches could have descended from a mainland finch species. If we're looking at islands, because of their isolation, they often have a very unique mix of organisms not found anywhere else. See this concept of adaptive radiation, where you have a first species A from the mainland that comes and inhabits the first island, and over time, as speciation occurs, and we have species that are isolated reproductively, then that population changes over time. This is the thought behind the differences seen in the Galapagos finches. Darwin wondered if a finch from South America was a common ancestor to all types of finches seen on the Galapagos Islands. New species might have arisen because the geographical distance between islands isolated bird populations. Over time, the finches could have evolved independently, and the current species had resulted from that accumulation of changes. Darwin's theory of natural selection is that individual organisms in a species exhibit variation that can be passed from one generation to the next. That is heritable variation, or variation that can be inherited genetically. Also, looking at selective pressure that causes an organism, or a population rather, to change over time is that organisms are going to compete for available resources, and there is a finite amount of resources. So competition is going to lead to some organisms outcompeting or surviving over other ones. individual organisms within a population will differ in terms of their reproductive success. That's that concept of differential reproductive success, that some individuals in a population have favorable traits that enable them to better compete for limited resources, and then have more offspring passing those traits on. Organisms become adapted to conditions as the environment changes. Natural selection through differential reproductive success shapes traits. The result of this descent with modification is adaptation, and an adaptation being any evolved trait that helps an organism be more suited to its environment. Not only did Darwin observe species, but he also looked at geological formations and how islands form. Darwin's observations of geological formations and species variation led him to propose a new process by which species change. This process, called evolution, proposes that species arise, change, and become extinct due to natural rather than supernatural forces. This new view was not readily accepted by Darwin's peers, but gained credibility gradually as a result of scientific and intellectual revolution of the late 1800s. 150 years after Darwin published his ideas of natural selection, it is now considered one of the unifying theories of biology. Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection explains both the unity and diversity of life on Earth. It looks at how all living organisms share a common ancestor and how species adapt to various habitats and ways of life.